demasiado.
Sí, entiendo.
Y, pero ya tengo 2 semanas aquí en Barcelona, sin viajar. Y pues un viaje muy seguro para mí. Y ya, agosto.
Sí, pero vas a tener que sacar
Exactly.
tus visas.
Los visas, sí, exactamente. No. And yeah, it's getting around Blank. Thank you both for being here again. It's wonderful to have you as regulars here at the Mexico Institute, and for supporting us always with your time and your efforts and your, most importantly, your intelligence. Thank you very much for being here. Luis, let me just say, on a personal note, I have such a good time working with you. It is really, really fun, and not just because you're a great raconteur, but because when I read your work, I actually laugh out loud sometimes, because there are things that you write that actually pique me in a certain way and just make me think, oh gosh, yes, I'd been thinking this all along, but I didn't know how to express it. And you have that way of saying things which really does encapsulate an understanding in a way that I've seen very few other people do. So thank you so much for allowing us to work with you and for giving us the honor of publishing now 2 books. Remember last year we were here presenting A Mexican Utopia, which is of course a very tongue-in-cheek title. I'd like to, in my comments at least, just talk about how those 2 books fit together a little bit as well. But without any further ado, Luis, congratulations, and please go ahead and explain to our audience here in the room and those who are watching online about the problem of power.
Thanks, Duncan. And let me start simply by thanking you for making it possible to publish my mischief. I meant to, the first one, it was sheer mischief. This wasn't supposed to be, but if you found it mischievous, it's all the better. You've been very generous in allowing me to publish these books, and I'm truly grateful. I'm also very grateful to Veronica and to Oliver for being here. Oliver was the first who read the book and made enormous, many comments and an enormous contribution to my thinking, and forced me to rewrite several parts. So I'm doubly grateful. And finally, I want also to thank Paxton, who's not here, but who did a fantastic job in editing the English version of the book. The idea that I tried to push forth, which is the result of both what I heard as criticism, comments, and the like from the previous book, and my own thinking over the last year, is how can Mexico get out of its morass? How can it break the vicious circle in which it finds itself? The issue in Mexico is the concentration of power. That served Mexico very well through the 20th century. In fact, there are 2 periods in Mexico's history, Mexico's independent history, that were very successful. One at the end of the 19th century with Porfirio Diaz, the other with the hardcore years of from about 1940s through the late 60s. Those were the years in which Mexico worked very well, the economy grew and the like. And the trait in both cases, the common denominator, was the concentration of power. In both cases, one in a person, the other in an institutional way, but in a Mexican way. It was, as one American author, Hansen, once wrote, the PRI was really the institutionalization of the Porfiriato, meaning that it encumbered a dictator for 6 years. But it was a 6-year limit. There was a 6-year cycle and limit to that power. So the concentration of power allowed the country to make progress, and in a way to be transformed from an agrarian society into an urban polity that it is today. What didn't happen was that the system never adjusted to the changes that it had provoked. It never adjusted, and it remains, in essence, the same system that it was in the 1920s when it was created by Plutarco Elias Calles and then strengthened and reshaped by Cárdenas, Lázaro Cárdenas. While that system matched the realities and circumstances of the country in the 40s, 50s, 60s, it no longer does so. The consequence is that we have problems in terms of the economy not growing in average fast enough. One of the things that Luis de la Calle mentioned very clearly and rightly a couple of weeks ago, that we had another program. is that Mexico, the average in Mexico doesn't really mean anything, because there are parts of Mexico which are growing at Asian rates. There are parts of Mexico which are contracting on a systematic basis. So the average doesn't say anything, but it does tell a lot about the country. And if you look at the places where it doesn't grow, those are the places where the concentration of power is greatest. The places where country grows fastest are the places where they are more distant from Mexico City, either physically or historically or both. And those are the places that are really transforming the country. But they're also creating an extremely divided country in terms of wealth, in terms of opportunity, in terms of possibility. It's not surprising that most of the people who left Mexico in the past 20, 30 years, coming to the States as migrants, came from states that are not growing, and it's a natural response. They are looking for opportunity, and if they can't find it there, they look elsewhere. You won't find many Mexicans from places like Querétaro or Aguascalientes or Sonora in the States. You'll find lots of them from Guerrero, from Oaxaca, from Michoacán, and the like. And the flip side of that is that those states don't grow. The question is why do the dwellers of the political system, the beneficiaries of the old system, remain in place? And the argument that I make in the book is that that they are very shielded. They are very protected from the population. They have a long-term. They hold office for the long term. The system that now will enter into effect in 2018 for re-election is fascinating, because it's very revealing, and it's the only example I'm going to give of how the system protects itself. And that is that the idea of those pushing for it, including myself, was to imitate that part of the US system where by creating re-election, you establish a link with the citizens, and they have to cater to them rather than to their bosses, their political bosses. There was just a little change in the structure in the original proposal, and that is that for somebody to get re-elected in the Congress or the Senate, they need the party hacks authorization, and that severs the link. It was a minor little thing that it was introduced at the very end, like last week's change in the anti-corruption bill, a minor tweak that changes everything. Politicians have been there forever in that system because they know how to manage it. They are not stupid. They know what makes their world turn. So we'll have the odd thing in re-election in Mexico that we have also a problem that was always obvious, which is that we have part of the Congress and the Senate by proportional representation, part by direct representation. But the long story short is that one individual, in the Senate, for instance, a person wins and becomes a senator. The first loser, so-called first minority, but it's the first loser, or the runner-up, also gets into the Senate. So we have a situation in which now with re-election, a person could be in the Senate for 2 terms, which is the limit, without ever having won an election. It's fascinating. Talk about distance from the electors. The reforms of the past 30 years have transformed Mexico. There's no way around it. We can criticize the depth of the transformation. We can cheer it. We can see the benefits and the costs. But it's astounding how Mexico's different if one looks back. In every regard, in production, in quality, in the way people think, in physically the infrastructure and the way the streets are being look different today. Surely some reforms have been more successful than others, but that might be true everywhere. But the framework within which the country operates has not changed that much. What has happened, and NAFTA is the perfect example, is that politicians recognize and understand full well that they cannot, that the old system doesn't work. So they carve out specific exceptions, and NAFTA is a humongous exception, which is a regime, a legal regime that protects investors, which is different and independent of the rest of Mexico. Many Mexican companies invest as American or Canadian companies because they are protected by NAFTA. So that way they are shielded from the rest. Part of the argument I made, or rather the reason I wrote this book, Utopia, before was why not for every Mexican? Why just for foreign investors? Simply because that would be a way to get everybody in there. So the question of power can be summarized as concentration, the ability to apply or not apply the law as at will at the will of the president, or to change regulations or to change the laws by the whim of a presidential decision without any check on power. President Peña passed an enormously ambitious set of reforms, and he was congratulated by everyone around the world, but very few paused to see that the way those were passed was simply through corruption. He bought the votes. That's true in every Congress in the world. I don't mean to say that it's different, but this was literally buying the votes, if you get my drift. So yes, those were passed, and the books show huge reforms, but that doesn't mean that they can be easily applied, because one thing is to convince the members of Congress by whatever means. Another is to actually get them to work on the ground, and this week we've seen what it means in the case of education. The reform was supposed to basically, its only purpose was to reshape the relationship between the union and the unions and the government, and it's not exactly going well, with the unions paralyzing half of Oaxaca, and now they burned the government house of Chihuahua and a few other places. So the proposal here was, let's bring the rule of law as a solution. What I then started working on is, how do you get to a position like that? How can it be built and developed? And at the end of the day, it's going to happen either through the pressure of the people, if it ever gets to be far enough, and I don't think that will ever happen, or by strong leadership that gets it. And I think that the only way to do it is by the workings of both together. I don't see any alternative. Mexicans have shown have proven to be very averse to violence. They don't want to threaten the stability of the country, and that's a trait that I think is admirable. It also has to do with the origin of Mexico. Of the political system. The PRI was much more like the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, minus the ideology. But the structure of building an hegemony and the like it makes Mexico much more similar to Russia than to Brazil or Argentina. And just like Russia, the Mexico never experienced a black and white change of government from Franco to democracy, or from Pinochet to democracy. Mexico has experienced a series of grays, just like the Russians, and Putin represents a continuation of the old system through different means, but it's not very different. And Mexico is much more like that, and people bought into the system and liked the system. Whether they were brainwashed or not, it's irrelevant. That's what they did, and what remains of that is extremely powerful. How will the next generations work it out after, if ever, an educational reform where not the traditional textbooks are used as the basis for ideological dissemination is an interesting question. My proposal here is to start moving into due process, to apply due process of law at every level. Due process has become sort of a whipping boy in the last few years, because the Supreme Court of Mexico issued a ruling on a woman who had been accused of kidnapping a French woman, and that's the reason that they responded, because it was a foreigner. who had been accused of kidnapping a person and killing the person. And then the Supreme Court decided that that her rights had been violated, and therefore due process had not been respected, and she was freed. Ever since then, lots of other cases have come to the court, and the court has been accepting them. And then one realizes how complicated the transition becomes, because you have kidnappers in the streets that suddenly a kidnappee finds and sees and gets scared to death. And lots of people are raising hell about those people being let out of jail. So how do you build a process where you eventually get the things right, even though there are some horrendous costs along the way? I think that's the one issue Mexico has to grapple with, but it cannot grapple with it until and unless the judicial system is changed and the police system is changed, and nobody's even thinking about that. We are introducing an enormously complicated new judicial system. Was supposed to be ready 8 years after it started, and this was last week. But nobody was told that it had to be ready, so a la Mexican, it's going to take a few more decades to get it ready. But whenever it happens, it's not going to be enough if the rest is not changed, because the violations to the due process of law in the judicial arena are systematic every single day. Nobody respects the scene of a crime. Nobody follows procedures. All those things. So the tasks are enormous and enormously complex, but the opportunities, I think, are equally great. And that's the issue in broad strokes that I wanted to tell here.
Thank you, Luis. Veronica.
Thank you. Thank you, Duncan, for the invitation, particularly to Luis. It is an honor to share the panel again with Oliver, Duncan, and dear friend Luis, and congratulations also for the book. I agree with Duncan because it's a powerful set of ideas, very clearly put forward and easy to understand, not easy to follow, but hopefully it shall bring light to the discussions we are facing in Mexico. And let me start by giving you a picture of a country where 20% of the people are satisfied with the state of their streets and avenues, and only 14% consider they are taken care of properly, they're maintaining good conditions, where 33%, 3 out of 10 citizens, are satisfied with the street lighting service, where 29% of the people are satisfied with public transportation services, where 62% of the people are satisfied with the water supply, but only 55% of the people consider it is potable water, where only 33% of the people are satisfied with the social security services, and 25% of the people are satisfied with the local police, where the main concerns of the citizens are, number 1, insecurity and delinquency. Number 2, 1 out of 2 citizens say corruption is their main concern, with a national average of 12,590 victims per 100,000 inhabitants. This is the picture of Mexico, and this is not a picture of post-revolutionary 20th century, early 20th century Mexico. This is not even mid-20th centuries after World War, turbulent times. Not even when the 2000, when the PRI lost the presidency. Not even 2008, after the international economic recession. This is the data from the 2015 National Survey of Government Quality and Impact, which is conducted by the Census Bureau in Mexico, a very respected and trusted institution. So this is a picture of a country that, as Luis was saying, is around the 11th or 12th economy of the world, but also has, by contrast, the standards of people's satisfaction with basic public utilities, public services, with the everyday life. It is clear that, as Luis Rubio says, our system of government is not working. And it's not working because it's not responding at a political level to the increased demands of a plural society, and it's dysfunctional at the administrative level as a provider of basic goods and services. So how do we get here? And Luis just mentioned very quickly and makes in the book a very interesting and a very precise and accurate historic account, and recalls how the system was built and created in the early 30s, the 20th century, basically to bring stability and stop bloodshed after the Mexican Revolution, where basically opponents were killed, and there was a not possible government at all. It served its purpose well, indeed. It was a great idea because it responded then to the people's aspirations of peace and order. And then again, throughout the first decades and to the middle of the 20th century, because it was the same demand of peace and order through post-war turbulent times. The system, as Luis said, concentrated power and distributed benefits according to loyalty and discipline to the system. It worked like that, and it was conceived for that purpose. It was most effective then in allowing for economic growth and social development. But the main flaw was that it was always about accommodating and giving certainty to political elites, not the citizens. The citizens were left out of the equation, and of course, it was never about implementing checks and balances or institutions. It was always the concentrated power who would give and accommodate for those political elites according to the needs, according to a new 6-year terms or 6 years dictators that allowed for oxygen in the political arena. Of course, expectations change over the time, and in the late 60s, after a huge economic growth and social development throughout the 40s, 50s, and then in the late 60s, expectations changed and the system started cracking, started breaking. The economic crisis and repeated economic crisis during the 70s and 80s, as well as the increasing demands for social and political participation, clashed with the monolithic system of government. Commercial liberalization in the late 80s, and particularly NAFTA and the free trade agreement with North America in the early 90s, improved the economic performance after the crisis, the previous crisis, and accelerated at the same time the separation between society and government. Political control then lost grounds to important reforms on the political side that gave way to authentic and to real electoral competitiveness, mainly the 1996 reform. Significantly, after that, the opposition took over majority in Congress in 1997, and soon after, the PRI lost the presidency in 2000. However, as Luis mentions, after all these years, it has been 80 years later, and even a double political alternation, the system still prevails, making it obvious that what worked for a traditional industrial economy doesn't work in the era of technology and information anymore. Why have we failed to update the system, and why what's happened? Luis gives reasons, and I take also a couple of them that I think are, in my view, interesting. One is a systematic failure to read messages and thus deriving the wrong lessons. Luis mentions that the events of the 1968, that was the repression and killing of students, which not only happened in Mexico, but in Mexico were significant, very significant, happened. And of course, there was a popular outrage, and people condemned the repression and the way the government responded. But the wrong lesson was that the government did not sanction, and no responsibilities were allocated to the people that were responsible of that. Instead of that, the government chose to withdraw altogether. So stop governing, and of course I don't mean repressing, but stop controlling and exerting power, and letting things get out of the way. So 68 became sort of like the original sin that stained the exercise of power ever since. And that is the source of the government deficit that we are, lagging up to now. But there are more cases, more cases of this failure to read the messages and insisting on deriving the wrong lessons. Even in the times of NAFTA, in the Carlos Salinas administration, the regime at that time thought that economic reforms alone could save the broken system. And it was clear that they did not do the trick. And that is an important lesson, as we have been mentioning, the difference and the similarities between 94 and 2014, 20 years later. Then again, in 2000, the victory and the triumph, undisputed triumph of Vicente Fox for the first time, with a huge political bonus. Then again, Fox wasted the social support he had with him to change the old system, and instead he was happy and he rejoiced because he just kicked the PRI out of Los Pinos, which is the presidential home in Mexico. Of course, that was a triumph, undisputed, as I say, but that was not an end in itself, and we keep confusing then the messages and confusing means with ends. Again, in 2006, the PAN got a second chance with Calderón by a narrow margin, so Mexicans were not thrilled with the political alternation, but the PAN won a second chance. However, Calderón set as his first priority the combat of organized crime, and kept postponing again the political transformation. The result was a very divided political climate and legislative stagnation that cost us the delay of the reforms still pending from years before. Then again, another message misread in my view, the return of the PRI in 2012. The return of the PRI was, yes, the people wanted to unlock the political and legislative stagnations. Economic reforms were needed, and they voted within the system, as Luis said. We don't like radical shifts, we don't like violent changes. They voted within the system in favor of those who had made possible the economic reforms in the first place. NAFTA, for instance, and for the alliance, for the political alliance that made them possible, PAN and PRI. But I think there were two wrong lessons derived from it. One, they underestimated the voters' disenchantment with the political alternation, as I mentioned, because the PAN lost its moral grounds and its moral quality with corruption scandals of the PAN itself. So the political elite became like all the same, and you were not able to distinguish between PRI's corruptions or PAN corruption. Secondly, the voters, as I mentioned, voted for the ones that made the reforms possible, but they did not want the old PRI ways back again, meaning exactly that kind of arrangement that fostered corruption. This year, I think the outcome of the past elections, June 5, where 12 states renewed governor, basically, and a lot of local elections, I think are clear. The citizens, again, are using vote to punish corrupt administrations. Since last year and this year, they have punished basically PRIP because there were 9 of them at stake, but they also sanctioned and punished banned corrupt administrations like Sonora last year. Opting for alternation and using alternation and divided governments to put in checks and balances that hasn't put the political system. That's the way the people and the more sophisticated voters are reacting. 8 out of 12 states changed of color, of party. 4 of them had never had government different from the PRI, out of 5 that were at stake. Only Hidalgo, which is interestingly the Ministry of the Interior birth state, and he's one of the possible candidates for 2018. But just that state out of the 5 that hadn't had any other government than PRI changed colors and are going to have a different administration, a different party governing for the first time. So those signs and those signals from the electorate, I think, are crucial to be well read in the years to come. The second reason why I think we haven't been able to update the system is our inability to close circles, to finish what we start. From infrastructure, you name it, every public deed, every involving resources, involving having to connect cities to major, like the international airport of Mexico City that has already undergone changes of plans. We have this inability to plan for the long term and follow that plan and finish it. To the new Mexico City's constitution that is going to be written by the new assembly. We make great plans, but with little success. We make great reforms, but with poor implementation. And that's the key, again, of not being able to complete what we start. That happened with NAFTA and with the process of continuing the strategic and structural reforms that were pending for 20 years. It took us 20 years to complete the structural reforms needed to see the results. So imagine if we are now with a set of great reforms as the energy reform, the telecommunications, the financial, education, etc. reforms, if we still have to wait for another 20 years to complete the cycle, the country won't hold that long. This is the Pacto por Mexico example that Luis also sets, is the confusing means with ends, and having the legislative part, which we said here was ironically going to be like the easy part, and just be content with having done the legislative work and not the implementation process. Without it, the reforms will have no impact and we'll be back to square one again. What next? We clearly need a new arrangement, and as Luis also states, 2 are the keys. 1, building and strengthening institutions, and we have a great opportunity with this new set of reforms. Albeit they are huge mistakes, like with a system of anti-corruption system, and that we have been having to, it's 1 step ahead and 2 backwards, and we're going, that's our regular pace for doing and changing things. Secondly, establishing an effective rule of law. That is the one that is going to be followed by everybody, starting by the government. This is where Luis Rubio's proposal in the book and I had the pleasure to present also here last year, Utopia, was the implementation of NAFTA for politics. That means a clear set of rules, clear sanctions, less discretionality in the enforcement of the law, and above all, the self-contention of the authorities, starting with the government in order to translate those benefits that were given to the foreign investors now to the Mexican citizens and to the Mexican people. That is the challenge. The risks are high for not seizing this opportunity and not seizing these last 2 years of this administration and misreading again the signals. Héctor Aguilar Camín, a Mexican writer, wrote recently in an article that President Peña's dilemma was either to work for his project or for his party. Of course, we would greatly benefit as a nation with the implementation and the conclusion of the project, the modernizing project that we already started. And of course, that could mean even that the PRI could lose in 2018 if it were to be implemented as it is, because of course it means affecting a lot of interests, starting even with the political system itself. Ironically, failing to read again the signals and not working in the people's interest, in the project interest in, could in the end mean that they would lose both, the party and the project. That's the risk at stake. 94, as I said, showed how economic reforms are necessary, but not enough, not sufficient to repair the broken system of government that we have. This could be the last chance. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronica. Oliver.
Well, thank you very much. Good morning to everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here and share with you this new piece by Luis, who produces a lot of work every quarter. I want to thank the Wilson Center for the invitation, in particular to Duncan and to Luis. It is a great pleasure to share the panel here with Veronica. And once again, Luis is ahead of different analysts and scholars on the future of Mexico. This book can be used to guide the discussions that are going to take place in Mexico and about the future. And I think it's a great continuation, as all of them described on the previous book, The Mexican Utopia. I'll try to put like a positive note, given the current circumstances, and try just to focus on what can be done, and just to bring together these two pieces. In the previous book, Luis described 3 possible sources of change in the functioning of the Mexican government. They were leadership, crisis, and the pressure from the civil society. In this new book, he suggests that the reorganization of power in the country can be done through incremental institutional changes to the due process, and that eventually are going to provide effective checks and balances in the political system, right? So the core of this argument is that the best way to reorganize and institutionalize power in Mexico is through mechanisms that will force the adoption of clear rules that could enhance predictability. It's good for investment, it's good, everybody wants to have predictability, right, in the future. So if you want to plan ahead, you need to know what's gonna be what are the rules and if they are gonna be followed. I completely agree. This is a basic principle in economics, and it's a basic principle in life, and the question is how to adopt these things. At the end, these incremental changes are the way to eventually professionalize the Mexican governments, meaning the municipal, the state, and the federal, the courts, and especially the legislative. So the main goal is to put all citizens in the center of the public arena. So in other words, we are talking about a new revolution that has never happened in Mexico. So it's like putting together in the reality that everybody has the same rights. It's in the Constitution, but in reality, it's not happening. So put this in the center of the discussion could be a complete change. So the key is to translate this, or what we have now, that is, and he quotes another author, that is called the illiberal democracy, which is governments are being elected, but the effective government is not working. We don't observe effective governments. So I think we're observing a huge change in this direction. So that's why I want to be a little bit positive. for the first time, lots of citizens, especially what I call the Mexi millennials, are demanding explanations from their government. So this was completely impossible like 15 years ago, 20 years ago. Like people demanding in the face of the president that to give explanations on what they are doing. And this is a big change. And unfortunately, or fortunately, we're gonna be observing this more and more. But the question is how to put these demands in an institutional way. So this could completely, this can change the system a lot. So, but let me build on Luis' arguments. And in my opinion, the current situation in Mexico is a combination of the three mechanisms that he described in the Utopia book. And it's like, it's putting, the past 4 years have put a minimal floor that are gonna give us the results for the next 15 ones. So first of all, the leadership. So as he points in the first part of this book, only a president from the PRI was able to pass the reforms that were needed. And these represented the end of the Mexican Revolution and the ideology of the Mexican Revolution in terms of putting like an oil company as the main or the backbone of the political system. So the change is huge. We haven't observed the consequences of these changes, but only a president from PRI was able to do this. So it will take years and years to convince, or for another person from another party to do this, but it was the perfect combination, I think, and President Peña did it. That was fine. Unfortunately, this leadership ended when the legislative process ended, and this government didn't know how to keep going and implement these changes to change the reality and put the citizens in the center of the attention. Then the second element, or the source of change, is the crisis. And nobody is talking about this, but Mexico has observed a tremendous change in the fiscal conditions over the last 4 years. If you see the Mexican public balance, today, oil revenues are around 10% of the total revenues in the government. 4 years ago, they were 40%. So obviously, there is a lot of debt. There is a lot of tax collection with the fiscal reform. But just to hold, I mean, they bought a lot of people. They expanded a lot of the government, but under terrible circumstances. So this is a source of. So we haven't observed the consequences, and the current situation in the international markets will push the government to face the reality in the near future. So as a consequence, these fiscal imbalances are, this could force the government to adopt new measures that are going to be a little bit, I'll say, difficult. Especially in the next fiscal year. Finally, the third component is the civil society. So we have observed different movements, like Yo Soy 132, the reaction to Ayotzinapa, and most recently the Ley 3 de 3. So these are some examples of how the middle class is pushing for checks and balances and a better government. So in the last case, it is also impressive that different organizations were able to convince 600,000 people in a few weeks to sign a petition or a citizens' initiative to pass a new law for transparency and accountability. It sounds easy, but it's not. So again, once again, these Mexi millennials are like are a source of change in the country that we're observing. So the recent local elections also are a sign of how civil society is reacting to bad governments, and it's pushing for to deliver, for governments to deliver. In other words, I think there is a big chance to observe incremental changes, as described by Luis, especially focus on respecting the procedures and observing the law, because in the absence of money, you need to put the rules, and just to find an equilibrium that is going to be accepted for everybody. So when you have a lot of money from the oil and a lot of discretion, it's easy to buy people. With no money, it's difficult, and it's easier to just try to push for laws. So the question is, who is going to adopt an agenda for incremental changes? And I think I don't see a person, an institution, or someone that is going or is pushing for this. That's why it's so important that for this book, or the moment for this book is really important. And what I observe are two risks, and really important risks, for the election of a populace that could eventually erode what we have gained over the last 15 years, or I'll say almost 30 years. So first of all, is the current reforms can increase, or the adoption or the economic adoption of these new reforms can increase the differences between the northern part of the country and the southern part. So what I'm saying is that with the energy reforms and all the adoption of new, or how the northern states are going to be more connected to the US, in reality, this is going to bring more difference between north and south. Obviously, the vote in one vote in Chiapas has the same weight as a vote in Chihuahua. So this is going to be a key challenge on how to reduce these differences, but at the same time, the reforms are provoking more integration and more separation from the South. So this can be a source of conflict, and there is no clear answer on how to reduce this. The second part is the risk of a crisis of the parties that are already in a crisis. And what do I mean? Governments between 1988 and today completed the agenda of the PAN. So if you see the PAN candidates document for the government, is pretty much what was implemented over the last 25 years. All the reforms, including this new one on transparency and the Sistema Anticorrupción. So this is going to be a huge crisis for the parties. You know, the members of PRI do not have a common ground anymore. So before it was Pemex, and now they don't have it. So what's going to be the main idea that they are going to put together to share as a common value? It cannot be only corruption. So it has to be something else. And I don't see what is the agenda there. It's the same for the PAN. They implemented all these reforms. The plan was completed. So what's next? Who is going to define what's the purpose of the party for the next 15 years? The only response could come from the left, including Morena and PRD, and trying to go back to the good old days. So these are the two sources of, or the two big risks that I observe. So at the end, I think I completely agree. It is important just to professionalize the government, and it has to be the agenda for the future. And putting together or saying that the citizens are the center of the agenda is the only way to go forward. Luis' analysis is an excellent source of, Luis' books is an excellent source of analysis, and could guide the discussion here. Once again, thank you very much for the invitation, and I really enjoyed reading the book.
Oliver, thank you very much, and to you, Veronica, as well. It's great to see how your comments actually come together. I'd like to make a few comments of my own before we open it up for discussion. And just to say what both of you have mentioned before, that the way that this follows on from A Mexican Utopia is it's very gratifying, because after reading A Mexican Utopia, there was a sense of like, yeah, I agree with you, so now what? Mm-hmm. And that's what you did. So that's, you know, as you said at the beginning, Luis, you were able to respond to some of the criticisms for that. And when we go back to A Mexican Utopia, the basic argument that I saw there was that in order to get the rule of law in Mexico, somebody needs to play that leadership role of limiting their own power. And where are you going to find somebody who's actually going to limit their own power? And that's where the tongue-in-cheek element of this is, because we're not going to actually find that person. So we then move on to the problem of power, which is a further analysis, diagnostic, as it were, or diagnosis of how we begin to find an alternative route. Rather than one person taking that leadership from the presidency, how do we actually begin to do it on an institutional basis? And the term institution, I think, is fundamental here. And as I was reading The Problem of Power, it brought me back to so many conversations that I had in Mexico with my colleagues during my time there about the difference between a política de gobierno and a política de Estado, and the need to really build strong state institutions. And we can have all kinds of discussions about whether or not Mexico has strong institutions. It does have strong institutions, but are they actually from the state as such, or are they from a government or an administration? Now, The Problem of Power, the Mexican Utopia became an important book in Mexico, I think, because it started conversations. And as we all know here at the Wilson Center, that's one of the things that we try to do. We try to have conversations. And when I get attacked from the left in Mexico, and then I get attacked by those people who support the government, I know that we're doing a good job because we've offended everybody. And that's one of the things that I think is, it's terrific to actually use these books as the conversation starter with folks here in DC, but also in Mexico. But we know that this is not a process and not a conversation that's going to finish anytime soon. And it's one of the reasons why we chose this image for the cover of the book. This is a bridge that's being constructed, and if you notice, it's a bridge to nowhere. It is an impressive piece of engineering that's going on there, but it's horribly incomplete. And there's even a picture of a boat there that seems to be sinking right beside it. Not quite sure what the symbolism of that is, but anyway. But the unfinished business, the bridge to where, is echoed in the book with the phrase that Luis uses, that Mexico is in a permanent transition to nowhere. We are transitioning constantly from a closed economy to an open economy, from an old or traditional economic structure to a modern economic structure. We are transitioning from a dictatorship to a democracy, supposedly, but nobody actually knows what any of those terms mean in reality. What is it we're actually trying to get to? And I find that a very compelling idea. And it's not that you actually have to know where you're going, but it helps.
If you want to get there.
If you'd like to get it. And if you don't know where you're going, any road takes you there. So that's one of the things that I think we're seeing in Mexico. But I want to turn to one of the most important elements of the book that I see, which is that it's about the concentration of power, the over-concentration of power, and yet ineffective government. And those two things at one level seem to be contradictory, but they're not, of course. They're very complementary as concepts. The concentration of power actually leads to a lack of governance or governing capacity. And I think if anybody reads the newspapers in Mexico today, watches the news, what's going on in Oaxaca is very much about that. You see a concentration of power at the level of the federal government, but an inability to govern at the local level. And one of the reasons for this is that because of the concentration of power in the hands of a few individuals and groups, as opposed to the concentration of power in the hands of the state. And so this is still not institutionalized power. We do not see the monopoly on the legitimate use of force or violence. We do not see a central government that works in line with rules, due process, to actually implement the reforms that we've been talking about so far. And perhaps one of the most important parts of this book, as I was reading through it for the first time, and one of those moments when I did actually laugh out loud and my wife looked at me as if I was crazy yet again, and it was where you write about the democratic transition, Luis, and you basically say, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, but this was not democratization, this was power sharing. And power sharing and democratization are two very, very different things. And for somebody who has studied Mexico for so long, I should have thought of that before, but I'd never had it in those terms, that simple language. And that makes perfect sense to me. Your argument there is that the PRI, recognizing that its situation was no longer tenable, decided to share power with the other political parties, not to enter into a competitive political system, not to enter into a competitive democracy, but to say, we will expand the elites so that other people can play, but by definition, we still exclude everybody else. And the interesting thing, of course, is that by that point in time, by the end of the 1990s, Mexico's economy had grown. Mexico was going through the transition brought about by the NAFTA, and so the pie had got bigger. You could share that pie with a bigger group of elites than you did before, quite comfortably, and you still all had enough to make you feel comfortable. And I think that's the way that you express that in this book really, really did help me to understand what we're actually going through right now. The part of the section of the book where you talk about the role of checks and balances, the role of the Supreme Court in particular, and referring to the system of the United States is crucial, and you mentioned it yourself in your opening comments. But the role of the different branches of government in controlling each other is something which has been pointed to many, many times in Mexico by saying we have a constitution which is quite similar to that of the United States, but in reality it functions very, very differently. I'm still not sure how we get the Supreme Court to do that after reading this book, and maybe that's something for a future project. But certainly, looking at the role of the legal system and the judicial system brings us to the question of due process, perhaps more than any other. And as I was reading this for the first time, I had lunch with a lawyer friend of mine who's been in the business for 40 years. And he asked me, he said, what do you think is the most important amendment of the US Constitution? And I said, I don't know. I'm not an American. I don't really understand these things. You know, freedom of expression. I don't know. He says, no, it's the 14th Amendment. And he said the 14th Amendment, due process in particular. And all of a sudden, you know, it comes up in this book. Now, establishing due process is incredibly complicated, as has already been discussed here. It takes time, it's very messy, and people resist it. But I think it was the same in the United States. I think we had to fight people had to fight a lot of battles here to get due process to be respected. And a lot of people didn't like that. In my own country, in Britain, it took a long time to get due process. And still, in both of those countries, you don't have equal treatment under the law. That's clear by any examination of the judicial systems of both countries. But you do at least have a respect for due process because you have a system in place which forces people to respect due process. And I think that's one of the things which is missing in Mexico. There are no consequences for not respecting due process. We need to hold judges responsible. We need to hold government ministers responsible. We need to hold functionaries responsible for not following due process. There needs to be a penalty there for not doing that. And you point in your book to saying that in the absence of due process, everything is about negotiation. And that brings us to one of those cultural elements about Mexico, which is that everything is negotiated in Mexico. Every single thing, from the moment that you wake up in the morning to the moment you go to sleep at night, you're negotiating. And I'm not just talking about your classic marital relations, which are all a negotiation, we know that. I'm talking about where you negotiate on the street, you're negotiating implicitly with other drivers on the periférico. You are negotiating in some way with the tax collectors by saying, well, you know, how do I pay my taxes? How am I going to pay my taxes? How much can I hide, etc. Now, to come back to the way in which you can actually make due process work, I think you've identified what the key is. And the key is actually to building state capacity. It's about the capacity to govern. And if you can do that, then you can not only put in place meaningful due process, you can put in place the ability to punish those people who do not follow due process. This is all about consolidating the state, from the concentration of power to actually the strengthening of the state. And I would like to say that I actually see that there is reason to be hopeful here. And I know I'm way too optimistic all of the time, but this is one area because it has been shown to be possible in this administration. The area that I dedicate most of my time to is the energy reform, and the energy reform has worked exceedingly well. And in part, it's because of the people who are in positions of power over there. In part, it's because the government itself recognized how important this reform is. In large part, it's because, just like with the NAFTA, it's about foreign companies coming in, and if you want to attract investment, you have to guarantee them due process and protections. But if you can do it there, can we find a way to move it to or to expand that so that the average Mexican citizen is protected by that? And I would say that that's where we hopefully get to the third book in the trilogy. I don't know whether it's the Return of the Jedi or what it is, but
Empire Strikes Back.
yes, exactly, it could well be. So a couple of things that I would just like to put out there as interesting areas of research for the future, and one of them for this next publication. One is, I think that the role of culture, and I don't fall into cultural determinism in any way, but I think the role of culture, it becomes important because now there is an ingrained culture that's been brought about by an incentive structure that's been in place for a long, long time. I was reading a book recently, I mentioned this to you yesterday, Luis, That Sweet Enemy, about the relationship between Britain and France over the centuries. And one of the things that comes out is that Britain itself has a culture of fair play. And fair play is actually very similar to the idea of due process and equal treatment.
Yes.
And I'm not sure we have a culture of fair play in Mexico. In fact, I'm pretty sure we don't. Now, I'm not saying you can create a culture of fair play like that, but certainly in the education system, that's one thing that we can help to inculcate or indoctrinate fair play. Secondly, both Oliver and Veronica have already talked about the role of civil society. And I thought one thing you just said, Oliver, was terrific. The parties don't have the answers right now, so are we going to turn to the left or are we going to turn to society? It's civil society in particular which gives me hope at this point in time. And although the Tres de Tres law got approved in a way that civil society didn't like, there is now hope because the reaction from civil society and business has been so powerful that now there's going to be a forced renegotiation of the terms of this piece of legislation. And I think this brings us to sort of the final question, which would be an intriguing question to ask for the third book. When does change happen? Why does change happen? And the classic Mexican answer has always been, change happens when it has to. We got an energy reform when you had to have an energy reform. But in fact, that answer is not correct. You began to understand the importance of reform once you had to do it, but it took more time than that. We're always late. There's a lag, right? You do it just before things fall apart, but not when you're supposed to do it. And I think that one thing we could perhaps learn from looking at other countries around the world is to say, when has society, business, forced transitions? Because we cannot rely upon the elites themselves to take the leadership. So how does the middle class do it? In what other countries? The case of Colombia being an obvious one, that when the middle classes really felt enough was enough, they pushed the government to do something about public insecurity. In other countries, when has democracy actually come about in a sustainable way, and how did society force that? And so I think that you always use so many great examples from other countries in your work. I think that would be a wonderful way to take this project forward, and I hope that we can continue to work together, Luis. Thank you very much. Luis, would you like to react right now, or would you like to take some questions from the audience?
I think we should take questions.
Okay. We've got a number of questions. 1, 2, 3. There we go. And then behind you, Chris, okay?
Oh, okay, great. So, thanks. Chris Wilson here at the Mexico Institute. I guess my question, coming back a little bit to the current political environment, and in some ways, I mean, you do a great job, Luis, of explaining why the incentives are aligned for the parties and the politicians, the status quo to prevail. But at the same time, we see this huge sort of movement from citizens in the recent elections, this huge anti-incumbent sentiment. And so I guess my question is there not a space for, within the political system, within the party system, a party to really take up the banner, to really recover the banner of being pro-democracy parties, essentially, to be a pro-liberal democracy party, for there to be a resurgence of, and for it to be a vehicle to win power by becoming a pro-due process party and a pro-anti-corruption party. So, looking forward and electorally, do you see, would a party that took up those banners be successful if it was possible?
Thank you. And then right behind you.
Yes, hi. You spoke on the
Sorry, would you mind identifying yourself?
Oh, I'm Julia Kassem. I'm a student assistant at the Urban Sustainability Lab here at the Wilson Center.
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask, we saw the aggregate economic impacts of NAFTA from 1994 and beyond, and how those impacts on investment had implications on legislation for years to come. But my question was, how did NAFTA impact the dynamics of citizen participation at the grassroots level and contribute to the political climate 20 years later?
Thank you. And then Antonio?
Thank you. Hello, I'm Antonio Ortiz Mena with Albright Stonebridge Group. And this is a comment-question. Political scientists love to think in categories. And when I was listening to you, I thought about an old book by Hirschman called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. So I don't know if this is the trilogy or whatever, but I think it would be useful to think about what you're proposing in terms of what is exit, what is voice, and what is loyalty. For example, is the Cente exit or is it strong voice? Is Morena, again, voice or is it really exit? Al diablo con sus instituciones. I think it would be very useful to couch the discussion in these terms, and maybe to think about possible scenarios. What would 2 or 3 scenarios, what would Mexico look like 10 or 15 years from now if we follow more of the path of voice or exit or of loyalty? So it's easy now, suggest someone else do it, but I think it would be extremely useful to do it this way, Luis.
Thank you. Luis?
Thank you to the three of you. Let me start with NAFTA. There was a big discussion in Mexico when NAFTA was proposed. It was not the same kind of discussion that there was in the States. In Mexico, it was rather a reaction by those who didn't want any kind of liberalization, any kind of opening, and they wanted a stronger state presence. They wanted less market mechanisms. 20 years or almost 25 years after, NAFTA is a given. Nobody argues about it. It's those who oppose it are totally marginal, and it's really exceptional, and it's only strictly on ideological terms, on ideological grounds. The Mexicans would much rather work in companies that are NAFTA bound, or not all of them have to be export-oriented companies, but there are many companies that are within that same general thrust. I mean, think of a pastry company, big pastry company. They don't export anything because of the nature of their products, but they own half the pastries in the U.S., half the pastries in Canada, Spain, Argentina, and so on and so forth. So they are exactly in the same wavelength. So NAFTA, I don't think there was that much popular discussion. Mexico didn't discuss many things other than in the media at that time, and typically among opinion makers, which were and certainly and still are a fairly small crowd. The big discussions these days, interestingly enough, are mostly in social media. We have now one governor who won an election through Facebook. It's rather exceptional. That's Nuevo León. It's rather exceptional because the penetration of the internet is not that great in the country. So my guess is that there are only two states that could follow that route. One is Monterrey. That's one of the most advanced states in the country. That's one of the wealthiest of the country. It's also 80% of the population dwells in the city of Monterrey or outskirts. It's different names, but it's the one big urban area. So that was possible. All other independent candidates have won cities, but not states, and they can't win states unless and until there's much more internet penetration. But the social media has become the grounds where discussions take place, and how that communicates with action, I have no idea. It surely communicates in electoral times. The polling companies have not been able to in Mexico and elsewhere, have not been able to really gather how that influences voting patterns. It's interesting that even though the result of Brexit was as predicted the day before, for months it was unclear, and many people were uncertain about whether it could predict it or not. So my point is that I don't know where Mexico stands in civil participation in this. But NAFTA is not an issue of discussion. That leads me to the question of whether there are parties capable and willing to take on the development of a modern liberal democracy. The natural party historically for that is PAN, which has failed miserably. They have, in contrast with the rest of the parties, they have failed in their own ethics and philosophy, and that's they really face an existential question. Up until about 6 p.m. on the 5th of June in the last election, they thought they would only win one state. They ended up with 7 in their lap, but they didn't know that. And that's because they didn't really win them. It's the other side that lost them. Interestingly, they lost 3 states that they held, which means that as incumbents they lost, as challengers they won. It's because it was an anti-incumbent vote, period. And they were there ready to catch the vote, that's all. The PAN was created in reaction, in 1939, in reaction to the existence of PRI, to the impunity, to the corruption of PRI, or Party of the Mexican Revolution then. And they were always promised to be a clean party, to be a professional party, to be an honest party. And they weren't. They fell for the same things, partly because that's what the incentives are, partly because they never changed the structure of power. And why that happened or didn't happen is another subject of another discussion. But the PAN faces an existential problem with themselves. They don't know how to differentiate themselves from anybody else. There's this humanist party which could be, at least in principle, could be the beginning of something like that. Its true leaders are in Guadalajara, more than the nominal leader who is as corrupt as everyone else, a former priista. I don't see them buying into this. In a way, Mexico remains very inward-looking and very self-contained, and I don't know if these things don't change it. I don't know what will. Among others, because more than 50% of Mexicans have a direct relative living elsewhere, mostly in the U.S., and that's an enormously powerful influence in the way people think. Partly because much of the money that pays for their livelihood comes from the U.S. Antonio, thanks for your idea. I think it's a neat way of. I read Hirschman many decades back. I'll reread him. It's a neat idea to look at who fits where in this. It seems to me that Mexico, we can find examples of the 3 in Mexico. The question is who pushes towards the future, which ultimately is the important thing. My father was a surgeon, and I often heard a comment when he was talking to his students. He used to say, when you go into surgery, you have to know 2 things. One is you have to know what you have to do, and the other is you have to know how to do it, otherwise don't start. And that brings me to something that Duncan said, which is that the problem is that with this transition to nowhere, is that nobody assumes, nobody sets an objective and tries to pursue it, other than their own particular petty interests or objectives. And at the end of the day, that's really what matters.
I don't know if we have any more comments. Diana, yes, please, and then one over here.
Thank you very much. Diana Negroponte here at the Wilson Center. I'd like to take up an issue which Duncan raised, which is culture, and address it to a gap in Luis's book, unless it's hidden in the pages that I haven't read, and that's education.
Sure is.
Our understanding of Mexico is that paternalism, whom you know, who you're loyal to in exchange for your contract or your job, is endemic, it's rooted. And yet here in the United States, we have sought to get rid of that through education and the development of skills and ability, individual ability. Is that not a key component of transformation in Mexico? And if so, why couldn't I find it in your book?
Thank you. Diana, would you mind passing just across the table here, lady? And then we've got one question at the back from Ariel.
Nicole Castillo, Washington Office on Latin America. As one of the cornerstones in your book, you discuss both institution building and the importance of rule of law. With all the judicial reform that's going on currently in Mexico, both on a federal and state level, where there's a lot of miscommunication as to what rules in one jurisdiction over another, how do you see the rule of law playing out over the next couple years or decades, as you say, until the judicial reform actually goes into place the way it's supposed to?
Thank you. And then a microphone for Ariel. Thank you.
Ariel Multatzos, communicator. I write for the Huffington Post. Now I can say it. It's very frustrating to be part of the government and to see that what you say in the book here, Luis, regarding the lesson of 1968 and the government not doing anything about the demonstrations or the social unrest or not enforcing the law, better put, is not only limited to that, but extends to practically every government activity. In Mexico, I think that some areas, or the most important areas of the government, know what they have to do. And many times it's clear that they need what they need to do, but they don't do it. There is this sort of invisible immobility into it. What do you think could trigger the disruption of that immobility and the sort of not only the will to execute things, but to actually execute them?
Thank you, Ariel. Luis.
Great questions, thank you. On the judicial, let me start with that one. On the judicial side, Mexico has done something very odd. It has invested heavily in federal justice and almost nothing in as we call it, common law justice, which is state level justice or for issues that are not federal. I saw a graph recently that Ana Laura Magaloni put together, where Mexico is an outlier, a radical outlier. It spends little in the judiciary in general, and it spends most of it in the federal arena compared to the US, Britain, Brazil, Argentina, and so on. So most of the problems of Mexico, most of the issues of crime and delinquency and the like and disorder are local, and yet it's been spending heavily and building capacity in the judiciary, in the federal judiciary. So the interesting and contradictory thing here is that it's not even building the capacity which affects the people most. And Laura's conclusion of that is that the demand from those who have the ability to get their processes to the federal level are mostly rich, whether companies or individuals, and therefore the system has responded to them. But that the problems for individuals or for the average citizen to get justice is really nil, and that's not even common sense. I mean, common sense in the discussions, let alone a project or a strategy to be dealt with. So I think there's a humongous gap there that is not being addressed. Diana, you always raise critical and fundamental questions, and thank you for that. How to change a culture is an enormously complicated question that in every country. It's fascinating to watch how Mexicans adapt in the US very quickly, and they become law-abiding. They follow the rules. They don't drive without a license. There are any number of things that they do, whereas in Mexico it doesn't really matter. They don't throw garbage through the windows of a car. They cross the border and they behave. So it's possible to change at the personal level, but it's very difficult to change as a nation, and much less so if there is no at least objective and a strategy to move in that direction. Surely education is critical. As in the judiciary, we're not even talking about that. At this point, the educational reform is strictly about labor relations, nothing else. So changing that is going to be fundamental, and surely paternalism is endemic. Not only endemic, it's one of the core elements of the pre-system that prevails and remains in place. Whether it was there before from the Spaniards, I don't know. I would have to find out. I mean, where it started. But surely during colonial times, these economic institutions like the hacienda, like the concessions and the like, had a feudal element that goes hand in hand with paternalism. It's a great question, and I'm going to work on it. Ariel, you raised a question that I've been thinking a lot about for the last many months, and I think that there's another one of the tensions of Mexico, and I think that's the response I think explains it. There's, aside from the tensions of the old Mexico and the new Mexico, the wealthy Mexico and the poor Mexico and so on, there's also a fundamental tension within the governing, within the people who are part or have been part of the government in the last 3 or 4 decades, since the technocrats came into the government, particularly in the late 80s or mid 80s to late 80s. And for the first time, Mexico had a true professional class of technocrats or civil servants who had as their only interest, as their only objective to run the country better and well. It's not that they came out of nowhere. They came out particularly from the central bank and Hacienda, but they had, with exceptions here and there, they had been totally absent from positions of influence. It was at the end of de la Madrid's term, and particularly in Salinas, that they came and became very important. And these guys had no political objectives. None of them wanted to be presidents. They were simply running things like civil servants. But they always clashed against the structure of power that allowed them to go only so far so as not to challenge the status quo, so as not to challenge the structure of power. So that explains why many of the reforms of those years didn't go far enough. Why liberalization of imports, for instance, just covered certain sectors, not all of them. Why services were not part of it. It's interesting. They did liberalize insurance because they were not very powerful insurance companies. But they didn't liberalize banks because they were very powerful banks. So all those things explain why those differences. But it's much more important in the political realm, where the powers that be didn't want to lose power, where they didn't want to affect special their own groups or interests. One of the things that was discussed in the panel 2 weeks ago was that that the wealthier, the more developed parts of Mexico are those that had gas ducts connected to their region. Well, one of the reasons no more gas ducts were built is because there was one politician who owned zillions of pipes that delivered gas or oil or whatever else, gasoline, and he had the power to make it impossible for ducts to be built. It's much more practical, much more effective, much more less costly to build the ducts, but he had a monopoly on the distribution. All those things are part of the reason why many of the reforms have underperformed relative to the objectives that were being proposed originally. So it's where the two sides of Mexico, the professional government officials, civil servants, and the politicians with interests in not changing the status quo.
Can I just add a word on the judicial reform and what you were asking? Exactly, we have like two levels of this judicial system, one federal and also the Supreme Court of Justice and the role that it has to play, and that is also put in the book by Luis and that I share. But the other side is on the local level and the judicial local powers. To that regard, I think we have two things that are going to be tested in the next couple of years. One of them is the new oral system, which entered into effect just last weekend, June 18th. And the other one is referred to as the daily justice, sort of like the common justice. And I think that these two are very important because they address exactly what the issues and the conflicts at daily life people address, because even though we have this huge organized crime problem, I mean, most of the people don't have to do or to deal with that or are not immersed in money laundering or drug trafficking or so. Most of the people face everyday challenges like, you know, suing your employer or a neighbor, or having mercantile issues between small businesses and things like that. So that's the issue addressed by the so-called daily or common justice, which is very important to install. And on the criminal side, this is a change of paradigm, absolutely, what we are entering into. And I also like to be positive into the thinking, but it's also been done like the Mexican way. We had 8 years to prepare for the entering in effect of the system. And of course, because there was a deadline, I mean, thank God we respected the deadline, because otherwise we wouldn't be even, you know, talking about it. But the truth is that of the 32 states, only 6 had made the changes necessary to, duly process the new system, which is a huge change of paradigm, as I was saying, because we are changing from a traditionally written process system that comes from the French and Spanish legal system, and we're changing into a more like oral Anglo-Saxon way of criminal procedures. And it has to change with the way even police act. It has to do with how they build or form the criminal cases, and then they go to the attorney general or to the district attorneys in this case, and then how they present the cases and how the judge has to be present. So anything goes by written, so it's all, you know, in a presential way, and the prosecutor and the defendant have to rest their cases, and the judge has to decide on whether the case has merits or not. But it's a huge change that needs to be taken at all levels, not only judges, but all the people that participate, even students, even law schools have to change the way they teach their students to be able to enter into this new system. So even though it officially came into effect last weekend, we are still going to see a lot of time taken to adjust and to really be able to deliver that kind of justice. And it's a huge challenge that hopefully one day we'll be able to meet. But that would be like the case study to also implement the daily justice, because now civil mercantile processes can also be taken into this oral system. And it's a challenge for the local capacities. And again, it's a challenge for the local administrations. When you change of governor and the new one doesn't feel compelled to attend this new process, even though it was prepared for 8 years, it was supposed to be ready and put in place. Well, you need to have these local authorities being challenged and being then punished, or if they don't meet with that expectation. So that's the new role of the civil society. And we saw in these elections that they are vigilant, and they are waiting for their authorities to be accountable, and they are going to be.
Thank you, Veronica. It sounds very much like me with a publishing deadline, I have to say. I have 8 years to prepare and to write the damn thing, and it's always the night before that I actually sit down to do it. Thank you very much to all of our wonderful panelists. Thank you, Luis, for letting us publish your book. Thank you all for being here today. Hope to see you again very soon.